The day I took the ranch, 7 widows held up 7 keys. Under the porch, the lock looked like a tooth just pulled. By night, Luke threw a dented key, opened the cellar, or opened the town's mouth. A wooden box and the dead man's letter waited ready. From the dry well, metal echoed up. One key lay in my pocket, another in the hunter's mind. Red dust clung to the boots as Thomas Hale pulled his horse to a stop before the long porch. Salted sweat had dried into white streaks on the reins. The horse breathed hard, nostrils spilling heat into the dry air. On the wooden steps, 7 women stood in a straight line, dark cloth dresses, low-brim hats, sun-browned wrists. Each held an identical key, leather thong wrapped twice, not old. No one smiled. They lifted the keys just high enough toward him, as if setting an object on a table without letting go. Thomas dismounted. The boot soles hit dry. He tied the reins to a porch post, shaved smooth at hand height, the wood dark with old oil. A strip of leather, whoever's it was, had once been wrapped there. Only the dent remained. Blackened with tar, wire drawn even. Not like an abandoned place, as the lawyer had said. The well beside the barn had a pulley bar wrapped in leather, the rope thin but fresh. Barn door hinges oiled, the shine still slick on the dark wood. He kept still. Sometimes still was the fastest way to make others speak. The wind shifted, the keys tilted toward him, their teeth aimed at his chest. The oldest woman watched him, eyes the color of stone baked long in the sun. Her cheekbones cut with vertical lines, not tired, not afraid, just waiting. "I don't know the law," Thomas said. "I just know my name is on the paper." He pulled the envelope out, flat on his palm, no shake. The horse behind shifted, pressing hoof to dirt, restless. One woman glanced quick at the envelope, enough to see the red seal, then back to his face. Her key had a shallow nick near the bow, knife-made, maybe for telling apart. The trail from the main road to the house held boot marks of many sizes, some smooth-soled, some shod. New over old, never messy. Habit in the placing. Thomas swallowed dry. He felt like the late one to a meeting the others had been at for years. He remembered the lawyer's words, "Just go, house is empty, gate key hangs on a nail." Here, no nail held any key. Only 7 hands held them, steady. Inside the frame of the door, a round wood peg stuck out, its empty space, as if waiting for something long, hung there, just taken down. Tightness at the throat. Not fear. Realizing he'd been walked down a single path without knowing. The oldest woman lowered her key to waist height, palm up, a motion like offering, but not quite giving. Her other hand pinched the apron's edge, fingers thick, 2 knuckles calloused. She said nothing. Thomas heard the faint rub of gun leather on cloth somewhere. No one drew, but the sound told him the story could turn bad for half a step wrong. He looked at the board again. The letter edges flared, like a knife cut when the wood was still wet. In the lower right corner, a dot no bigger than a nailhead, set between 2 letters. Not a slip. Intentional. Someone used to marking like that. He didn't know who. But it wasn't for strangers. It was for the warned. About the keys. "How long have you kept them?" he asked. The question felt needless even as it left his mouth. Long, he knew. Each bow worn smooth where a thumb rested, teeth barely chipped. They didn't turn locks often. They just kept them. No answer. The last woman on the left cleared her throat, barely. On her wrist, a black thread tied to an old ivory button. The button was scratched with a faint E, the work of an unsteady, often to scrape off mud. The freshest mark shone lighter than the rest. He stepped onto the first stair. The step groaned. 7 keys lowered in unison by half an inch, like a thin fence. Thomas stopped. No one touched him, but the air between him and the lock was cold enough to tell him, "Don't rush." "How do you make them all enough?" he asked. The word enough snagged between tongue and teeth, sounding like metal caught in a vise. A flicker passed between the 2 women in the center, then nothing. He pulled off his right glove. The callus at the base of his index finger brushed the leather edge. He set the envelope on the porch step, a hand span from the rim. Waited for a hand to take it. None did. Their eyes stayed on him, not on the paper. Thomas started when something small bounced near his boot, a bit of brass. He bent and picked it up. The broken head of a key, the U-notch missing a piece, the cord hole warped. Cold. Just fallen, but not new. He looked up. A younger woman in the line tightened her grip on her key. Lips pressed. Offered no reason for the break, no apology, said it was for rough work. Out in the yard, a clothesline stretched between 2 posts, holding 2 white kitchen towels, water drops falling straight into the dirt, making neat, round marks. A house where work was being done. Beside it, a wooden ladder leaned against the wall, the 3rd rung chipped at one corner. Fresh chip, the wood paler. Someone had been up and down. Thomas drew a deep breath, lungs burned. He removed his hat. Salt had tangled his hair. The hat came down on the porch step, brim brushing the envelope. He met the eyes of the lead woman. "If I say I am enough, would you believe me?" Stupid question. He knew. Belief wasn't bought with that sentence. It came after whatever had been taken from one another. Here, that hadn't been taken yet. She drew in air slowly. Shoulders rose a fraction, fell. She touched the chain of keys with her other hand no longer than a breath. Thomas heard the horse rub its head against the post. The reins clicked. He noticed a thin black mark beside the door at hip height, like the print of a gunstock set there by habit. Clear, straight as a rule. He shifted half a step left, out of that invisible path. Small move, but a few pairs of eyes softened by a degree. Inside, the sound of a match struck. Not for smoking, for lamp wick. Yellow light cracked through the curtain. Heartbeat under the ribs, like someone tapping time in a far-off room. Not fast, but steady enough to know he could still choose. Choose to stand. Choose silence. Choose not to pretend to understand. "What do you want from me?" he said. This time, no pleading. Just placing an object where it belonged. The question set on the porch between the envelope, the hat, and the axe. Whoever wanted to take it could. The lead woman didn't answer. She raised her key again, to chest height. The others followed. 7 keys forming a metal comb, teeth aimed at a single point, the space before the lock under the floor. The wind shifted again, dust lifted, swept through the plank gaps, settling on the key teeth, catching the light like chalk on a lip. Thomas felt his throat dry. Suddenly, he understood the choke point. He hadn't come to claim. He'd come to prove who he was, with something not in the envelope. Paper spoke the name. Keys spoke the right. But what they waited for was neither. Far off, a metal bell at the gate swayed once in the wind. Not hoofbeats, not a person, just wind. The 7 women didn't turn. They'd learned not to follow the sound of approach. Waited for the sound to stop. Thomas lifted the envelope, put it back in his pocket, picked up his hat, stood straight. His left hand, without thinking, touched the inside breast pocket, where he kept the small folding knife. The knife's edge lay cold against skin through cloth. He left it there. A knife wouldn't open a key, wouldn't read the words on the board. He caught a small detail on the board's edge. An arrow carved, pointing down, right above the word open. The arrow was shallow, like a blade test, but enough to see someone had stood here, looked at these letters, and marked it for themselves. He didn't know who, a foster father, a child, one of the 7. His throat tightened once, not for the letters, for the arrow pointing straight to the lock under the floor. "All right," Thomas said, quiet. He stepped back half a pace from the porch, giving space to the 7 keys. None stepped forward. They held their hands as they were, eyes fixed. The smell of iron stayed. The damp wood taste stayed on his tongue. The sky wasn't darkening fast, but the porch shadow had lengthened a touch. The board's shadow fell across the floor like a short headstone. At the far edge of the yard, a water barrel on a porch step beside his hat. The brass rolled once, stopped, chipped tooth pointing toward the lock. No one drew breath faster. No one moved. But for the briefest instant, the gray eyes of the lead woman softened by half a grain of dust, then hardened again. She lifted her key just enough for the evening light to strike its teeth. Thomas didn't know if that was assent or warning, but his chest eased by one breath. Wind struck for the 3rd time. The keys clinked together again. This time the sound was higher, almost clear. Thomas blinked. The game had no spoken rules, but the rules stood here, on the porch, weighted with metal, leather, carved letters, and a chipped brass piece, now lying still. And he, if he meant to enter, would have to learn to read them through other hands, other eyes, and the long silences drawn like the chain under the floor. He didn't ask more, didn't beg, didn't argue the lawyer's lie. The feeling of betrayal passed over like wind, sharp enough to sting, then gone. Before him was something truer than paper. 7 keys held out without being given, and under his feet a lock in the wood, waiting until it was enough. He stood there, hat in hand, eyes on the board, still, until the gate bell swayed again, this time with a faint beat under the wind. The beat of a door not yet opened, the beat of a name at the threshold, but not yet inside. Ella lifted her chin, voice dry as sand. Without the 8th man's key, you can't open the main house. She spoke slow, each word set down like on a table. Thomas meant to ask who the eighth was, but the other eyes all slid toward the trail leading out of the yard. A pale strip of dust, fresh boot prints over old. No one looked straight at him now. Their keys stayed at chest height, teeth aimed at the space before the lock under the porch. He blinked. Hale. She had said it clear. Same surname as his. Breath caught halfway. He stepped back a half pace to see the porch in full. The wind shifted, carrying dry leaves and hearth ash. On the far fence post, a black strip of cloth was tied as a marker, the wind snapping it against the wood with a flat flap. A sign for someone to return, or to stay gone. Come in, Soap. Ella set a stack of papers on the table, used the edge of her hand to square them. Paper yellowed at the corners, cover fold worn, crease sealed with a lump of beeswax. Thomas stood opposite, hand pausing on the chair's back, not sitting. A younger woman opened a drawer, took out a bone-handled paper knife, hinge loose, blade worn smooth for 2/3 its length. She placed it by the stack, blade pointed toward Thomas. Not threat, just for opening. Ella pressed a finger to the top edge of the pile, slid it toward him. The signature showed like a cut mark. J. M. Hale. The black ink had faded to brown, the M's tail reaching into a hooked flourish Thomas had once seen on an old letter. In the lower corner, a fingerprint rolled in ink, ridgelines sharp, a faint whirl at the center. He set his index finger's tip at its edge without touching. His nail caught the paper's cut edge, a light scratch raising a red bead under the skin. He drew his hand back. The last line was heavier than the rest, as if the pen had passed twice. Protect them until the secret ends. The word ends was drawn long, its tail smeared where the ink was still wet when folded. Thomas read it once, then again. His heartbeat was firm but deep. In his head, the lawyer's voice clicked like a jammed latch. It's just a transfer form. No sheet in the file had mentioned this. No other signature but his foster father's. Renew. Ella tapped a blank just below the final line. A small box, ruled with a straight edge, left for a name and a new date. Beside it, a tiny carved dot like a nail head, the mark J.M. had always used. Thomas swallowed dry. He rolled the fountain pen in his pocket, hearing the light tap of metal on a shirt button. Signing here would stretch a dead man's promise into the hand of the living. He looked toward the window, curtain pulled tight. Below it, light leaked in a thin line, clinging to dust. "What if I don't?" Thomas asked. Ella didn't answer at once. She set her forefinger on the word secret, held it there. Looking at her hand, he saw an old burn scar, round as a cup rim, pale, dry. "No land," she said, pulling her hand back as if from heat. She turned, lifted a small tin from the shelf, opened and closed it without a sound. In that pause, waiting. He set the nib to its rim, didn't press. Sweat slicked his palm. He lifted the pen, capped it again. Not yet. As the light dimmed, a short ring sounded from the metal bell at the gate. Not wind. Hoofbeats came, a single gate, iron knocking on gravel like tapping a drum lid. A shadow stretched into the doorway's frame. Ella didn't look at Thomas. She went straight to the porch, her hand sliding over the tabletop, dragging the paper's edge. Thomas rose, the pen knocking once into his pocket. Leather saddle creaked, reins rasped. A man stopped his horse at the porch shadow's edge, where the day's last light slanted. Dust on his coat, cuffs worn, hat pulled low. From a side pouch, he pulled something small, tossed it into the yard like a pebble. It spun 3 times, lay still. A dented key, bow bent, cord hole flattened, a tooth broken away. "You won't get that cellar open," his voice rough, breaking at the end. "Not unless you want the whole town to hear about it." He said you, but his eyes passed over Thomas, landed on Ella. There was a dry curl of a smile in them. Not warm. Ella reached to the shelf by the door, took down a short-barreled gun. Didn't draw it clear, just held it, muzzle outward, level to her hand, palm firm. Her trigger finger stayed off the guard. She lifted her chin by 1 notch. "Name?" she asked. "Luke," he answered, no pause. "Luke, no last name." The corner of his mouth pulled into something like a smile, but it never touched his eyes. The 7 women didn't step onto the porch. They stood in the doorway's shade, each apart. None pocketed their keys. Steel light on their teeth flashed, scattering short points across the floorboards. Thomas stood midway up the steps, enough to see the dented key lying in the yard, the dust packed into its grooves, dulling the brass to gray. The man had brought a key, but had placed it in no one's hand. "What cellar?" Thomas blurted. Luke turned his head, glanced at him once. The look slid past, didn't stop. "The kind folks keep locked when there's something they don't want seen," he said, teeth on an unlit cigarette. The tip was crushed, spilling a little tobacco dust on the saddle's edge. He couldn't brush it off, just wet his lips, voice hoarse from dust. Ella's gun lifted half an inch, the stock grazing the doorframe with a hardwood tap. Luke tilted his head by a small degree, as if measuring who would shoot first. His fingers weren't near a gun, didn't need to be. He had something else. The key on the ground, and a sentence that could seep through any wall. The wind thickened with oil scent. Thomas bent, closer to the porch floor. Between 2 boards, a glossy black streak seeped out, as if poured carelessly. Beneath, a bright-plated chain lay taut, greedy, each link clean, unrusted, as if freshly washed. The thick cast lock showed tiny pockmarks from the sand mold, but the keyhole mouth was burnished, smooth from recent turns, many and not long ago. He looked at his hands. Dust clung to his knuckles, fine as flour. He pushed himself upright. Oil from the wood's edge had smeared a crescent on his boot tip. "Town likes a story," Luke said, dropping the cigarette, grinding it once under his boot toe. He didn't look at the dented key. He looked at the wooden sign on the porch, read it with his eyes, not his mouth. When his gaze passed over the word open, his lip twitched. "All the keys," he repeated softly, like tasting a word. Then he turned his palm up, shook it so a steel ring on his ring finger caught light. Inside, something was engraved. Light flashed along the cut groove. Thomas couldn't read it, but the lines were deep, the craftsman steady. Ella moved within the span of a breath. "Go," she said, nothing more. Luke gave one short, dry laugh, like boot heel on stone. He jerked the reins, the horse shifted its hindquarters, kicking up a fan of dust. "I'll leave the key," he said, head unturned. "The 8th man knows how to use it." He dug in his heels, hooves cracked the gravel, the sound fading. The gate bell swayed once more, then stilled. No one inside picked up the key at once. Ella lowered the gun, stock resting on her knee, muzzle toward the floor. She propped it against the wall, stepped down to the lower step, stopping short of the yard. The fine dust line Thomas had avoided earlier broke under her heel, no longer straight. She didn't bend. Her veined hand opened and closed in the air, as if weighing something heavy but unseen. Thomas walked slowly to the porch edge. The dented key lay on its side, teeth aimed toward the gate, as if pulled, then dropped. He wanted to pick it up. His fingers shook, part from oil. A woman in the doorway's shadow shook her head, barely, almost not at all. Just enough to mean, don't touch. He stayed put, looked back inside. The paper stack was still open, the box under the last line still blank. The pen in his pocket felt heavier. In his nose, oil and old ink pressed over each other. Beneath the porch, the chain shone like fish in a water pulley. Each link was new. Someone had prepared to lock tight, or to open at the right moment, not for an empty-handed arrival. His gut dipped like a hollow underfoot. Unease seeped from chest to stomach, settled like a small stone in a pocket. The eighth man bore the name Hale. Who? Every eye had turned toward the trail at that name. Could be the man she meant. Could be someone the lawyer never mentioned. Could be a name he'd signed to a postcard once, back before he learned to see his outside. Oil sheen at the mouth, bright-plated chain, the whole house like a chest holding its breath, waiting for a stranger's hand to fit the right key to the right mouth, waiting for the small click a town could hear farther than the wind. The kitchen was dimmer than the front room. A small window of frosted glass let the evening in as a dirty yellow patch. On the brick wall behind the cast-iron stove ran a hairline groove. Ella took a wide-headed nail from a drawer, its shaft blackened by smoke. She set it in the groove, turned it half a turn. The third brick from the bottom pushed out a fraction, then slid into her palm like a thin book. Old brick smell mixed with damp ash and sweat. Behind was a shallow cavity. She reached in, drew out a low wooden box, brass clasp scuffed, lid held by two leather strips, the leather's edges cracked like lips in desert wind. She set it on the table, didn't pull a chair. The 7 women stood in the shadow's edge, not crowding. Their keys still in hand, teeth down, steel biting into floorboard light. Ella opened the box, no sound. Inside, gray coarse cloth lined the bottom, edged with green thread, now faded. On it lay small bits of metal, a bent dog tag, a scratched wedding ring, a brass button stamped with a bird's head worn to blur. Pinned under the lining were a few photographs, silvered and curled, their surfaces scratched like by sand. Each tag bore a machine-stamped name. Jackson, Arthur, Miguel. No surname needed to know, each had once breathed. "We keep these," Ella said, her voice cut short between clauses. She didn't look at Thomas. She looked at the tags as if they were teeth pulled. Thomas reached out. His fingertip touched cold metal. Cold from years in a wall. Cold from the fact that the one who'd worn it hadn't left it by accident. One tag had a black scorch, like from a cigarette. One ring was squeezed out of round, inside dusted with white powder like lime. In the photos, 7 men stood before some backdrop, each in his own stance, one smiling with lips slowed apart, one clamped shut. Their collars were frayed. One had buttoned his shirt wrong, off by one. "They died so we could live." Ella spoke very slowly, like reading a memorized line, to keep her hands steady. None of the 7 women disagreed. None looked away. Thomas set the tag down, its landing softer than its weight. He saw the brown polished spot on the box's brass clasp where leather had rubbed it smooth. The box had been opened many times. Not first today, only today, with a man named Hale watching. In the kitchen's corner, a string hung a bunch of dried onions. Their shadow fell in rings on the floor. Each ring looked like a stack of bands. Without reason, Ella closed the box lid. Didn't press, just lowered it. She slid it back into the cavity, the brick falling flush into place without a seam. The wide-headed nail went back into the drawer among harmless things. A wooden spoon, a spool of thread, rusted scissors. She turned back, met Thomas's eyes for the span of a breath. No apology, no plea. Only placing him on the far side of the sentence. They died, so we could live. By morning, the heat hadn't risen, but the dust had. The early light lay silver as fishbone along the barbed wire fence. The gate bell rang twice, no wind. 3 horses appeared at the head of the trail, dust caked to the riders' lashes. Luke in the center. The other 2 fanned wide without signal. They were used to standing like that in front of other men's doors. Thomas stood on the porch. Beside his boot lay his hat, brim dropped low enough to shade the chipped plank edge. Beneath the boards, the bright-plated chain lay still, oil clinging around each link like a varnish of scales. The thick-cast lock stared upward like an eye. On the porch board, the carved words from yesterday remained. Only the dust in the grooves had thickened by the thinnest layer. Luke reined in, let the horse breathe. His mouth worked on something, not tobacco. His face didn't smile. He gave a small nod, like to someone known. "Today we open," he said, without asking. The 2 others eased half a curve apart, one to each window, eyes never glancing in. They looked at the porch as at a safe. "In exchange," Thomas said, throat dry as scorched paper. He didn't say the word silence. It was already in the air. Luke dropped his hand, fingers tapping a rhythm on the saddle edge. Steady. The one on the right picked at the horse's shoe strap as if teasing out a thorn. The one on the left straightened his neck scarf, exposing a thin cut over a tendon. The air was leather, horse sweat, old ash, the mix of a morning before the town stirred. Thomas touched his revolver. 5 rounds loaded, 1 chamber left empty, a habit learned from an old man at the saloon. Leave 1 empty for the accident. His finger traced the steel ridge, feeling the cold set deep in the skin. He didn't raise it, not yet. The old letter sat in his inner pocket, paper thick, edges softened by sweat. He'd read it 3 times in the night, under lamplight, stopping each time at a sentence drawn out like a chain. Protect them by making the predator walk away. Strange words. No order to fight. No order to shoot. Order to make. "Don't open." "Fine," said the one on the left, voice light as breath. "We burn the barn first." Old sack, coarse fiber, mouth tied with jute in a tight sailor's knot. He tossed it, not far, so it landed in the strip of sunlight before the porch. It hit with a solid sound. Not empty. Luke didn't bend. The one on the right swung down, stepped and lifted the sack with 3 fingers. Dust swirled around his hand, clung to the hair on his arm. He loosened the knot, jerked it free. No sound from the rope. Inside, a few dull, bright pieces wrapped in rag. A broken silver necklace. 2 Mexican coins dented at the edge. A pair of gold earrings with sand-scratched backs. At the bottom, a folded sheaf of paper, edges stiff as if cut with a fresh blade. He opened it, but his eyes weren't for reading. He passed it to Luke. Luke held the corners with thumb and forefinger, steady. The dry seal of the land office showed clear, purple as a bruise. Name of transfer, place. A description in lines, numbers, bearings, directions. Wasteland on the border. No water, no named trees, only rock and wind. Thomas watched Luke's eyes as he read. His lids twitched almost too slightly to see. "This," Thomas said, neither lifting his chin nor lowering his gaze, "is enough to keep you busy." He didn't say rich, didn't say changed life. He said busy. Busy to be gone from here. Busy so no hand would set fire to the barn tonight. Busy so the town would have another story. A pause. Horses breathed, misting white at their muzzles. The man on the left struck the matchbox, closed it again, unlit. His hand slowed. The cellar under the board stayed an unblinking eye. The chain stayed the fish lying still under wood. Luke folded the paper, tapped its edge straight, slipped it into his shirt near his heart. No one told him to. He did it like tucking a card up his sleeve. He dipped into the sack, scooped 2 coins, tossed them lightly and caught them, the silver clink like keys. The corner of his mouth edged into a thin curve. Not kind, not pretty. "You just handed us the real key," Luke said, loud enough for the porch to hear, low enough the town couldn't. He said key like it had been in his mouth many times before. His breath hit the word real, dropped it like a dry bead onto the dirt. Thomas stood straight, spine stiff as a beam. He didn't ask which key. He knew he'd set the wheel moving. But the wheel seemed to roll in a shade different from his push. In his pocket the old letter grew heavier. Make the predator walk away. Didn't say how far. Didn't say they wouldn't look back. Didn't say they wouldn't take something with them. "Rock and dust won't give you water," Thomas said, voice low, not daring. "Only wind, and wind marks." He said it for himself. Luke hearing it didn't matter. The man on the right had tied the sack shut again, set it on Luke's saddle like a servant setting a coat on a chair. The man on the left put the matchbox in his inner pocket, thumb tapping its edge twice. Inside, someone drew the curtain. Sliver. A blade of light cut the floor, then withdrew. The center horse's rein shook once. The gate bell far off rang back like 2 metals recognizing each other. Thomas looked past Luke's shoulder, down the trail, the ground opening like an old scar. On that scar, the dust caught light like phosphor. Luke lifted the reins, didn't urge the horse at once. He tilted his head, eyes on the porch floor where Open's shadow fell. "The 8th man reads paper like he reads a lock," he said, half smiling, half not. "Thanks." He turned the horse, the other 2 moving with him, not looking back. Dust rose, clouding the porch from sight. When the dust settled, the porch felt like a tooth just pulled. Thomas leaned his hand lightly on the post. His palm touched the knife-smoothed patch in the wood, felt its slickness. From the kitchen came the faint clink of pans, then silence. Ella appeared in the doorway, her eyes whiter in the light's reflection. She didn't ask what he'd given. She didn't ask why. She looked down at the lock under the floor, then into the dark beneath, as one might look into a sleeping eye. "They'll be back," she said. No threat, no plea, just a marker in time. Thomas nodded. In his inner pocket, the old letter pressed into his rib. He could hear the words without a mouth. Make them walk away. He had just made them go. But under the sound of receding steps, he heard something else. The faint slide of a key's teeth through a lock, as if in a dream that leaves a trace of metal in the morning air. He laid his hand over the pocket, feeling the raised edge of the paper like a borderline. Out on that borderland, wind would guide those who could read stone. The 7 women said nothing. They lowered their keys all at once. Teeth struck skirt cloth with a short, needle-like sound. In that moment, Thomas understood Luke's real key might not have been in the burlap sack. It might be in their hands. It might be in the way he had just shown himself, ready to give what wasn't his, to keep what belonged to no one for sure. And that, to men like Luke, was a map. In the yard, the wheel ruts of 3 horses overlapped yesterday's track, deepening the trail by a thin layer. A crow flew from the dead wire to the cottonwood, gave a warped cry, then was silent. On the wooden sign, dust in the carved letters stirred faintly in the wind. One grain falling, vanishing on the floorboards like salt. Thomas bent, not to catch it, but to listen. The chain under the porch was still. But somewhere beyond the border, something had opened. Not the cellar, not the lock. Leather ash lingered, like something set down on the porch and forgotten. Ella stood on the step, eyes fixed on the spot in the boards where the lock had lain for years. She knelt on one knee, reached under the plank, pulled out the thick cast weight. Oil slicked her fingers, glossy. Thomas saw it drip past her knuckle, fall as a black bead to the wood. She said nothing. The bright-plated chain slid from the hook with a short click. She cradled the lock like a hot stone, then walked straight to the yard, past the split wood stack, past the water barrel with its clinging drop. The morning wind was light. Dust hadn't settled. At the rim of the dry well, the stone edge was worn hollow where hands had often rested. An old rope hung slack, knot frayed like tired joints. Ella set her feet shoulder-width, leaned, and let the lock drop with both hands. Metal slid along stone, oiled. The sound that rose from deep below wasn't a thud, wasn't a clang, but the heavy note of something finding its exact bottom. A period. The whole yard heard it. Thomas swallowed. Oil's taste clung in his throat. One woman pressed a stone at the rim as if to keep the wind from tipping it. Her hand was cracked across the knuckle, wrapped with a strip of cloth. The cloth was dark with oil. "Done," Ella said, without looking at anyone. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving 2 shining streaks. Her hands shook once, like after lifting more than weight should allow. In the front room, a low tin chest sat open. Curved lid, single latch. The lid's edge bit into the body so rain couldn't seep, though here rain was rare. The other 6 women entered, silent. Each slipped the leather loop from her wrist, drew out her key. The sound of leather sliding skin was a soft rasp. They laid the keys in the chest, one by one, teeth touching tin with a sound just enough to hear. Only one key stayed in a hand. The youngest stood still half a beat. Then she dropped hers in too, leaving another in her skirt pocket, unseen by Thomas. Ella straightened a piece of jute cord, lined the keys in a row, teeth one way. She lowered the lid. The latch caught with a click. They carried the chest into the yard. No wagon. 2 hands to a side. It was heavy with the kind of metal that holds sound. They passed under the old cottonwood. The trunk split along a ring, resin dried white at the cracks. Ella set the chest down, patted the lid once, not hard. Thomas brought the shovel, the wood of its handle glossed where hands had held. He dug. The dry topsoil took the blade with a hard sound. The spade shaved a thin layer of scent of what's long been buried. Ella signaled. They lowered the chest. Its sides scraped the wall. Sand hissed. The bottom landed with a muted weight. Thomas filled the hole. Blade drew back dirt, spread it over, new ground shading against the old. Small roots crossed the surface like stitches. The youngest knelt, patted it flat, nails mud dark. She leaned back, exhaled. No one made the sign of the cross. No one spoke. Only the sound of earth firming under hands, settling. When the hole was full, the ground dipped slightly. Thomas tamped the edge flat with his boots. Another woman laid a dry branch across it. Ella bent, chose 3 small stones, set them in a triangle. Not to mark it, to look as if they'd always been there. The wind passed, dust settling a faint coat. The chest was gone, as if it had never been. The keys gone with it, except one. Thomas stood by the trunk, eyes catching an old carving in the bark, a crooked H leaning left. The pale new wood at the cut's edge had darkened. Someone had stood here once and marked themselves into the tree. Not today, before. He wondered whose hand. Could have been his foster father, could have been the eighth man. His throat caught for a beat, like on a grain of dust too large. They washed the shovel at the barrel. Water drops fell to dry earth, spreading into small dark circles that vanished fast. Mud film clung to the barrel's rim in a thin brown line. One woman put the shovel back in its place against the wall, its tip touching the floor with a short, dry ting. Brief. Final. Everything back where it belonged. Afternoon dropped, but the sun hadn't drained away. The smell of horse smoke still clung in the wind, stale. No one lit the stove. Thomas stood on the porch, hand on the post. Under his palm was the same knife-smoothed patch. He looked out at the trail, fresh hoof prints pressed over the old, deep as a new groove. In the sparse, burned grass lay a half-dead cigarette butt, its edge still glowing a pinprick, then dimming. He didn't step on it, didn't pick it up, just watched until it cooled to a dark grain. He knew Luke had taken what he couldn't afford to lose, the habit of being willing to give a part, to keep the rest. This was the smell of that. Not oil, not iron. The smell of how a man comes back because of a burlap sack. A smell that draws a return. The danger now wasn't the cellar. The cellar had gone mute at the bottom of the well. The danger was the one who knew the way to the door and didn't mind coming back. Night Row, carrying an oil lamp unlit, new wick, glass cleaned. She set it on the window shelf without lighting it. The moon's light was enough. Her eyes didn't ask how late he meant to sit, didn't ask. She went on like a thick tree shadow. Soap on her hands smelled clean. On the door frame, Thomas noticed again, only now seeing it, at hip height, a polished mark from years of a gunstock resting there. The mark ran a hand's length. Straight. This house had learned to lean on a gun long before tonight. He set his palm on it. Wood cool, skin warm. The pause between them was a gap deep enough for fear to drop into and stay. Around midnight the wind shifted. The horse smell thinned, replaced by cold sand. In the yard the clothesline twisted slightly, wooden pins biting fabric with a soft tick. Thomas listened to each tick, each like a pin pricking skin, marking the passage of the hour. He opened the letter. Paper gave a small rasp. The old line was still there. Protect them by making the predator walk away. No other instructions, no map, no eighth man's name. Nothing but the handwriting of one who had died so the living could hold it. The lump in his throat passed slow. He folded it, slid it under the chair cushion. Didn't sleep. By first light, soft footsteps came up behind. He turned. The youngest woman stood there, plain black dress, hands folded in front. She wasn't flustered, just silent. On her wrist, a thin leather strip, wrapped twice, not tight like a mooring line. She unwrapped it. A key lay in her palm, teeth still sharp, not nicked, not marked. Metal dim with handprints. "You keep it," she said, "in case we can't in time." Quiet, steady. She placed it in his hand. The weight was nothing, but cold. Cold like stone. The cold went straight into his palm, up to the wrist, stopping at the elbow. Thomas closed his fist. The key fit as if cut to his hand. He heard the leather rub, like dry grass sliding over a nail. He slipped it into his inner pocket. Now the letter and the key lay side by side, divided by one layer of cloth. Two things not of the same family, but together. The weight wasn't in grams. It was in how every step after knew exactly what was in his pocket. He nodded. She didn't wait for a word. She pulled her hand back, turned. As her skirt edge passed, the fabric brushed his knee, a touch light as an unfinished sentence. A tooth gap. When the wind rose, the sound deepened, then fell off when it eased. No one said it sounded like a person. No one compared it. All stood listening. Each held something. Apron edge, wooden spoon handle, the chain of keys, now gone. Thomas gripped the chair arm, his thick finger resting on the carved H, spine straight. No one said Luke would return. No one needed to. On the porch edge, the horse tracks still damp with dust. On the board, one grain of dust fell from the letter's groove, leaving a tiny, white gap. In the dry well, something shifted faintly below. Stone scraping, maybe, or wind through the throat, or metal cooling to still. Everyone knew that when what's at the bottom cooled, the surface would heat. By steps, by voices, by the eyes of someone standing on the porch again. No new key needed, just intent. And intent couldn't be buried under a tree. The porch board stayed dark as the night gone. The carved words, "Only the one who holds them all may open," lay quiet in new dust. The grooves filled fine as salt on an old pan. Thomas ran the back of his hand lightly over the word open, dust marking his skin in a gray streak. Beneath it, where the lock had been, the floor gaped, empty as a lost tooth. The plank edge was raw from years of metal wear, the cut face paler than its surround, not yet dulled. Wind came through the gap, let out a long, small sound like a breath, half let go. He set his hat by the post, knelt so his eyes met the floor. Oil from last night clung under his nails, a thin black line. He lifted a small splinter from the edge, sharp, the tip pricking blood on contact. He pulled back. The splinter dropped, rolled once, slipped into the gap. The dry clink vanished. Inside, a ceramic cup scraped somewhere, stopped. No one came out. No one said careful. Only the clothesline clicked in the wind, steady as a count strung overhead. The doorframe's gunstock mark lay long, straight, smooth. Thomas set his palm on it, wood cool, edge clean as a blade. He pictured the old lock back in place, pictured the small click of key meeting teeth, pictured the chain drawn tight, metal on metal. Then he pushed it out of his head. The gap needed to stay a gap. He reached for a tin of nails on the porch corner, bent lid, mixed old and new. Opened it, looked at a row of nail heads upturned to the sky. Closed it, didn't use one. Nails could hold a board. They couldn't hold intent. Dust rose in the sun, a slanting trail like smoke. Under that slant, the groove of the word, open, showed the tip mark of a knife. He passed the dry well, he paused. The stone rim was colder than the air, old moss clinging dry and rough in the joints. An old rope lay slack across the mouth. Hemp fibers fluffed, the knot loose in two loops, like someone's hurried tie. Thomas pulled lightly. The rope shifted half a finger's width, rasping against stone. The sound dry. The wind turned. From far below came a glint of metal sound, its source unclear. Not long, not loud, just a single note rising, then falling, like a coin dropped into water, but there was no water at the bottom. He set his hand on the rim, fingers finding the hollow worn by generations of hands. Skin to stone, cold. An old question rose in him. If I looked down, what would I see? He leaned forward slowly. Wind from the shaft blew back up, pushing the smell of damp rock into his face. He stopped just where his shadow touched the edge. Didn't lean farther. His hand left the rim. He retied the rope's tail the way he'd learned on the riverfront. One live loop, one dead, end tucked in. The knot sat tight, plain, enough to hold. He laid the rope back in place, not lowering it another inch. A dry leaf dropped into the well, spun 3 times, vanished. No sound, no ripple. Only a pause, thickening between 2 breaths. On the opposite edge, a lizard lay belly up on a flat stone, eyes half shut. Its tail swept the dust so faintly it drew a curved line, like handwriting. Thomas wiped his palm on his pant leg, rubbing away old oil. He replayed the metal sound in his head. It could have been the lock, or a splinter falling into a cracked bottom, or something else shifting in the dark. He didn't need to know. He walked away, shoulders straight, eyes forward. Behind him, his shadow crossed the mouth of the well, and vanished on the ground, like a stranger passing through a frame. On the rope's fibers, a single white hair had been caught who knew how long. The wind touched it, making it stir like the smallest wave of a hand. No one but him saw it. He left it there like the scent of metal settling into sleep. The cottonwood shadow stretched long, pulling away from its base, laying a dark cloth across the cracked yard. Ant trails crossed it in straight lines, like large stitches. By the roots, where the earth had been filled, the surface sagged slightly, just enough for a sharp eye to see the change between old and new. Ella's 3 small stones sat in their triangle, each side uneven. One tilted, its edge buried, face to the sky. Dust scaled key. The skin bore a faint dent, the shape of a sunken ring. The true key sat in his inner pocket, pressed against the edge of the letter, the 2 touching each time he drew breath. Each touch was a beat of memory, what he had kept and what he had given away. The wind shifted scent, less ash, more dust. The sun leaned low, throwing shadow across the porch sign. The word open drowned in shade, the others still legible. A woman stepped onto the porch, hung the wet cloth on the line. The wooden pin bit the fabric. Water dropped in a single spot, hollowing tiny holes in the fine dust. No one spoke. No one said Luke's name. A crow shifted branches, from the old wire to the barn beam. Its claws rasped on the wood, then went still. Thomas sat on the cottonwood's root, back to the trunk, hands on his knees. His coat hem brushed the dirt, picked up dust. He drew the key from his pocket, not fully, just enough for the leather tie's edge to show. The wind flicked it, like a small fish breathing. He pushed it back in, deeper, until it rested still beneath the cloth. His eyes stayed on the 3 stones. He tipped the tilted one with his boot until it balanced. It rocked once, then held. The triangle, still imperfect, but firm. He left it. More would show. From the fence came the creak of cold, tensed wire. The post groaned low, far down the trail. No one moved, dust lying down like someone winded. Beside the house, the axe stayed planted in the round, its blade darkening with the sun. On the porch step, a fresh boot print held dry mud along the sole's edge in a fan pattern. Thomas compared it to the one from that morning. The angles differed, not his. Could be a woman passing while he was at the well. Could be someone standing outside, watching, while he didn't know. A coolness slid into his neck. The wind carried a faint, far metal on metal, old contact. He opened the letter again, just to one line. The ink that had faded by morning was fainter still, the angled light making the words curve. Protect them, as if another word had once stood after them, a word his eyes skipped every time. But there wasn't. Only the ink's tail, hand shaking at life's end. He folded it. The edge brushed his left chest. Beside it, the key shifted once, then stilled. The two didn't speak, they only touched. Above, the cottonwood leaves swayed, their shadows mottling his coat like water. A dried pod let go, light, drifting sideways until it snagged on the fence wire, its white floss spread like a small smoke. It didn't drop. It hung there, waiting for a wind with enough weight. At the fresh soil, a large dimmed after. The dust in the carved groove sat heavier, sinking deeper into the knife cuts. On the porch, the gap stayed open, darker than the rest, its board edge bare. At the well, the rope lay still like a sleeping snake. By the cottonwood, the ground had sunk another half a bean's depth. Thomas lifted his hat, set it on his head, rose. Dust fell from his coat hem, silent. He crossed the porch, his hand passing the carved words without touching. Past the well, eyes forward, his heel even with the stone rim, then on, paused a breath at the tree's base, looking at the new earth's surface, doing nothing more. The wind eased through. Roots under his boots shifted far below. Where secrets are buried, time doesn't smooth them. It draws each root deeper, tighter. And everything beneath, metal, promise, a piece of a man, stayed by that grip. No lock hung on the porch, no key lifted in hand, only lengthening shadow, thickening dust, and the sense of a door still open toward footsteps yet to come. The porch still bore the sign carved, "Only the one who holds them all may open," but the lock was gone, leaving an absence like a tooth pulled. At the well, metal still chimed at times when the wind shifted. Under the cottonwood, the tin chest lay unmoved, roots binding tighter each day. Thomas carried a key in his pocket, Luke carried the real key in his head, and the town carried a story no one dared tell in full. To keep a secret in order to keep living, is that also a kind of betrayal? If it were you, would you open the cellar or leave it shut and accept the cost? Say what you believe before dust fills every cut.